The lights came on at 9:47 p.m., exactly 3 minutes after I'd confirmed with Central Maine Power that the house had no active electrical service and wouldn't until Monday. I was standing in the kitchen with my phone still pressed to my ear when every lamp in the living room ignited with that particular warm glow that only incandescent bulbs from another era can produce. The customer service representative was mid-sentence about scheduling a reconnection when I heard myself say, "I need to call you back," and ended the call. I hadn't touched a single switch. There were no generators. The breaker box in the basement hung open like a mouth, every circuit in the off position, exactly as I'd left it after my inspection that morning. But the house was filling with light, room by room, as if someone was walking through it with purpose. Flipping switches I could hear clicking from where I stood frozen by the sink. My mother's sister died in February, and I inherited the house in Lubec, Maine, the easternmost town in the United States, a detail Aunt Vera mentioned in every letter she ever sent me. She'd lived there for 43 years in the old lighthouse keeper's cottage, though the lighthouse itself had been automated since 1939, and the keeper's position eliminated decades before she arrived. The house sat on a granite point overlooking the Bay of Fundy, where the fog rolled in like a living thing, and the tide could rise 28 feet in 6 hours. I hadn't seen Vera in person since I was 12. My mother never spoke about why they'd stopped talking, and when I asked as a child, she'd say only that Vera chose that house over everything else. At the funeral, which I'd organized by phone from Boston, only 4 people came. The local librarian, the postal worker who'd delivered to the route for 30 years, the lawyer who handled the estate, and a neighbor I'd never heard Vera mention, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen who'd lived 2 miles down the coastal road, and who told me, with odd intensity, "Your aunt was a good keeper, the best since your grandmother." I didn't know what she meant by keeper, and when I asked, she just patted my hand and said, "You'll understand soon enough." The lawyer who handled the estate mentioned that Vera had left specific instructions. The house was to pass to me, unoccupied, with nothing removed or altered before I arrived. Not a single dish washed, not a single paper thrown away. Everything exactly as it had been the morning she died in her sleep in the upstairs bedroom. He'd seemed uncomfortable relaying this instruction, as if he thought it was macabre or controlling. But I'd just nodded and agreed. The silence from my mother's side of the family was absolute. No cousins called. No distant relatives contested the will. No one asked for keepsakes or heirlooms. It was as if they'd all agreed, without speaking, to let Vera's house pass out of their awareness entirely. When I mentioned the inheritance to my mother, she'd been quiet for a long moment before saying, "Sell it quickly, Hannah. Don't spend time there. Just sell it and put the money toward your student loans." I'd promised I would, but I'd also known I needed to see it first, to understand what Vera had spent 4 decades protecting in her isolation, to make sense of the choice that had cost her a relationship with her only sister. I drove up on a Friday in late March with a weekend bag and a plan to assess what I'd inherited before putting it on the market. The realtor I'd consulted by email was optimistic about waterfront property, even this far north, even in a town as remote as Lubec. "A coastal Maine is coastal Maine," she'd said. "Someone will want it." I'd been in the house for 8 hours when the lights came on, and in that moment, with impossible illumination flooding the rooms around me, I understood that whatever I'd inherited was not going to be as simple as cleaning out a deceased relative's belongings and listing a property for sale. Before we continue, subscribe if you want to keep hearing stories like this. Stories these houses were never meant to tell. The house was smaller than I remembered from childhood photographs. A 2-story structure of weathered cedar shingles, the wood bleached silver gray by decades of salt air and the punishing winters that came this far north. The front door faced away from the water, as if the house had deliberately turned its back on the bay, though every window on the ocean side commanded a view of the granite point, the lighthouse ruins, and the vast expanse of the Bay of Fundy stretching toward Canada. Inside, everything was precisely maintained but deeply impersonal, furniture arranged with geometric exactness, as if Vera had used a ruler to ensure equal distances from walls and other pieces. Surfaces clear of clutter, no magazines, no mail, no random accumulation of life's debris. The kitchen counter held a single coffee mug turned upside down on a dish towel. The living room contained a sofa, 2 chairs, a side table with a lamp, and nothing else except for a single framed maritime chart hanging above the fireplace. No family photographs, no artwork, no decorative objects, just the essential furniture and that one chart, which showed the local waters in meticulous detail, depth soundings, navigation hazards, the curve of the coastline from Lubec to Eastport and beyond. But it was the notebooks that caught my attention first, before the lights, before any of the strangeness that would come later. I found them in the late afternoon, while investigating a locked drawer in the desk by the living room window. The desk itself was beautiful, antique oak, probably from the 1920s, with brass hardware that had aged to a dull patina. I'd noticed it immediately upon entering the house, drawn by its solitary presence in the corner, positioned to face both the window and the room. The key was in a dish on the mantel, labeled in Vera's precise handwriting. Desk, lower right. I'd opened the drawer expecting personal papers, maybe a will or insurance documents, the administrative detritus of a single woman's solitary life. Instead, I found 17 identical composition notebooks, the kind with black and white marbled covers that students use, stacked in perfect chronological order. Their covers were dated by year in the same precise hand: 1981, 1982, 1983, continuing an unbroken sequence through 2024. The final entry in the 2024 notebook was dated March 17th, 3 days before Vera died. I'd pulled out the most recent one first, sat down in the chair by the window, and opened to a random page in the middle. What I found made no immediate sense. January 15th, lights, 9:47 p.m. Living room, hallway, kitchen, bedroom, same sequence. Duration, 2 hours, 29 minutes, fog moderate. Ships, 2, moving northeast, house stable. January 16th, lights, 9:47 p.m. Living room, hallway, kitchen, bedroom, same sequence. Duration, 2 hours, 31 minutes. Clear sky, ships, 0, house stable. January 17th, lights, 9:47 p.m. Living room, hallway, kitchen, bedroom, same sequence. Duration, 2 hours, 28 minutes. Fog heavy. Ships, 4, moving northeast and southwest. House stable. Page after page, year after year. The same time. Always 9:47 p.m. Always noting which rooms, which sequence, how long the lights lasted, any changes to the pattern. I flipped backward through the notebook, finding the same entry stretching back through months, the only variations being the number of ships Vera claimed to see, and the weather conditions. Ships. What ships? The Bay of Fundy wasn't heavily trafficked anymore. Most commercial shipping went to larger ports. And what did she mean by house stable? I pulled out an earlier notebook, 1995, and found more variation. Different times occasionally, though 9:47 p.m. was still the most common. Longer entries describing what Vera called responses and recognition. Notes about trying different things, leaving lights on manually before 9:47, turning breakers off, opening windows, closing curtains. Each experiment documented with scientific precision, each result noted without interpretation. June 3, 1995. Attempted to preempt the sequence by manually lighting all lamps at 9:30 p.m. At 9:47, the lamps I'd lit dimmed momentarily, then returned to normal brightness. The bedroom lamp, which I'd left off, came on by itself. Conclusion: the house prefers to initiate the sequence independently. It adjusts when I interfere but maintains its essential pattern. The house prefers, as if the house had preferences, as if it was making choices. I set down the 1995 notebook and pulled out the earliest one, 1981. The first entry was dated June 14th, 2 days after Vera had moved in, according to the estate lawyer's timeline. I arrived on June 12th. The house was exactly as Mother left it, clean, organized, waiting. I'd promised Sarah I'd just clear it out and sell it. But when I walked through the door, I understood why Mother never left, why she spent 37 years here alone after they took away her position, why she refused every invitation, every plea to move closer to family, every argument that she was wasting her life in isolation. The house isn't empty. I don't mean haunted. I've spent 2 nights here now and I'm not frightened. I mean, it's not empty. There's something here that isn't me, and it's been waiting. Last night, at 9:47 p.m., I was reading in the living room when every lamp in the house came on simultaneously. I hadn't plugged them in. I hadn't turned on the breaker. I'd been using flashlights and candles, planning to call the power company in the morning. But the lights came on anyway. They stayed on for 3 hours and 17 minutes, then went off all at once, leaving me in darkness again. I sat there in the dark, listening to the house settle around me, and I understood what Mother had been doing here all those years. She hadn't been hiding. She hadn't been running from her grief after father died. She'd been keeping watch. Someone has to keep watch. I don't know yet what that means, but I'm going to stay until I understand. Sarah will be angry. She'll say I'm throwing my life away just like Mother did. But there are worse things than staying where you're needed, even if you don't yet understand why you're needed. I was still reading when the sun set over the point. I'd lost track of time completely, absorbed in the strange evolution of Vera's documentation. The house had grown cold around me. The heating system was electric, and I'd been managing with the fireplace I'd lit when I arrived, and the sleeping bag I'd brought, not knowing what condition the house would be in. I'd planned to drive into town for dinner. There was a diner I'd passed on the way in, one of those classic Maine establishments with lobster rolls and blueberry pie. But the notebooks had held me in place, and now it was full dark outside, the kind of profound darkness you only get in places far from cities, where the nearest streetlight is miles away. That's when I noticed the clock on the mantel, an old wind-up mechanism that Vera must have maintained carefully because it was still running, still keeping perfect time. 9:43 p.m. I set down the notebook. My hands were shaking, though I told myself it was just the cold. 4 minutes. I stood up, muscles stiff from sitting too long in one position, and moved toward the kitchen where my phone was charging off a portable battery pack I'd brought. I should call the power company back, I thought. There must be some mistake in their records. Maybe there was a separate line, a backup system Vera had installed, something that explained the entries in the notebooks. I was forming these rational thoughts, constructing these reasonable explanations, walking through the dark hallway toward the kitchen, when I heard the first click, a light switch, somewhere upstairs, the distinctive sound of a toggle switch being flipped, the small mechanical snap that's impossible to mistake for anything else. Then another, closer. In the hallway I was standing in, then the living room behind me flooded with warm, impossible light. I spun around and saw both floor lamps flanking the sofa burning bright, the table lamp by the chair where I'd been sitting, the overhead fixture I hadn't even tried because the power was disconnected, and I'd assumed it wouldn't work, all of them glowing with steady, gentle light that had no source, no power feeding it, no explanation that made any sense. I ran to the nearest lamp and traced the cord with shaking fingers. It led to the wall outlet and stopped there, unplugged, completely disconnected. But the bulb was burning as if nothing was wrong, as if electricity was flowing through circuits that didn't exist. I yanked open the desk drawer where I'd found the notebooks, grabbed the most recent one, flipped to the last entry Vera had made before she died. March 17th, lights, 9:47 p.m., full sequence. Duration anticipated, 2 hours, 30 minutes. Fog forecast for evening. She arrives tomorrow. I've prepared everything I can. The house knows she's coming. I can feel it in the way the floors settle, the way the windows reflect. Final observation. The house is ready. I hope she is too. Tomorrow. She arrives tomorrow. That was today. I had arrived today. Vera had known I was coming. 3 days before she died. She'd written that the house knew I was coming. The hallway light clicked on behind me. I could see the glow spreading under the kitchen door, warm and golden and absolutely impossible. Then I heard footsteps above my head. Not heavy, not threatening, just purposeful. The sound of someone who lived here, who knew exactly where they were going, moving through familiar rooms with familiar intention. But I was alone in the house. I grabbed my phone with fingers that could barely hold it, pulled up the central Maine power number I'd called earlier, and made the call I described at the very beginning. My voice was shaking as I explained the situation to a different customer service representative, who patiently confirmed what I already knew. There was no power connected to this address, no active service, no possible electrical source. While she was talking, I watched the reflection in the darkened glass of the maritime chart. The bedroom light on the second floor came on, visible through the window's ghostly mirror. Then I heard the characteristic hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen starting up, running on electricity that didn't exist. I ended the call and stood in the illuminated living room, surrounded by light that had no source, listening to the house settle around me with small sounds of satisfaction. The house wasn't haunted. The house was doing exactly what it had always done, what it had done every night at 9:47 p.m. for 43 years, while Vera sat in her chair and witnessed. And Vera had spent those 4 decades not trying to stop it, not trying to explain it, but simply documenting it with the precision of someone who understood that the witnessing itself was the point. I pulled out my phone and made a new note, mimicking Vera's format without fully understanding why. March 20th. Lights. 9:47 p.m. Living room, hallway, kitchen, bedroom. First observation. I am Hannah Wheeler, Vera's niece, Margaret's granddaughter. The house is showing me what they saw. I don't understand yet, but I'm watching. I didn't sleep that night. I tried. Went upstairs to what had clearly been Vera's bedroom. Saw the narrow bed made with hospital corners, the single pillow, the nightstand with a lamp that was now burning without power. But lying in that bed felt like trespassing, like occupying a space that wasn't meant for me. So I came back downstairs and sat in my car in the driveway with the engine running and the heat on, the house visible through the windshield. Every window blazed with light that shouldn't exist. I could see into the living room, see the lamps burning steadily, see the empty chair where Vera had sat for 43 years watching this exact phenomenon. I could see the upstairs bedroom window glowing warm against the dark sky. Around midnight, the lights began to go off in reverse sequence. Bedroom first, then kitchen, then hallway, then living room. Each room going dark with the same deliberate progression, as if someone was walking through the house turning off switches, conserving energy that wasn't being consumed in the first place. By 12:17 a.m., the house was completely dark again. I documented the times in my phone, adding to the note I'd started, mimicking Vera's precision without understanding why it mattered. But it felt important, necessary, as if failing to record what I'd witnessed would somehow be a betrayal of something I didn't yet comprehend. When the sun rose over the bay at 5:43 a.m., turning the water silver and gold, I went back inside. In daylight, the house felt completely different, ordinary, even welcoming. The lamps stood unplugged exactly as I'd left them, their bulbs cool to the touch, no scorch marks or heat damage or any evidence that they'd been burning for hours. The refrigerator was silent and warm. The breaker box in the basement still hung open with every circuit in the off position. I made coffee using my camping stove, boiling water in a small pot, and pouring it over grounds in a French press I'd brought from Boston. The familiar ritual steadied me. I sat at Vera's kitchen table, a simple wooden piece that seated two, though I doubted Vera had ever had a dinner guest in the decades she'd lived here, and started reading the notebooks from the beginning in chronological order. The early entries were longer, more personal, less systematic. Vera described the same lights I'd witnessed, but her reaction was entirely different from mine. Where I'd felt shock and fear, she'd felt what she called recognition. She wrote about it in entries spanning the first weeks after she'd moved in. June 20th, 1981. The lights have come on 6 times now, always at 9:47 p.m., always following the same sequence. I should be frightened, but I'm not. I keep thinking about Mother, about how she lived here alone for 37 years after they eliminated her position. Everyone thought she was eccentric, maybe even unstable. Sarah certainly thought so. But what if she stayed because she knew? What if she understood something the rest of us didn't? I found her logbook today, tucked in the back of the linen closet on the second floor. She kept records too, from 1942 until 1979. 37 years of nightly observations, all noting the same thing. Lights at 9:47 p.m. She called it keeping the watch, though she never explained what that meant. There's a note in her handwriting on the inside cover. The house learned to remember. Someone has to witness what it remembers, or the memory fades. This is the keeper's obligation. I set down my coffee cup, my heart suddenly pounding. My grandmother, Margaret Wheeler, had kept the same records Vera had kept, had witnessed the same impossible lights for 37 years. I pulled out my laptop and searched for more information about my grandmother, something I'd never thought to do before because she'd died when I was 2 years old, and my mother rarely spoke about her. I found a brief obituary from June 1979, listing survivors and noting that she'd been a lighthouse keeper in Lubec from 1935 to 1939 when the position was eliminated. 4 years as an official lighthouse keeper. Then 37 years of... what? Living in the keeper's cottage after the position no longer existed. I kept reading Vera's notebooks, and a pattern emerged. She wasn't investigating the lights in the way a skeptic or a scientist might. She wasn't trying to debunk them or explain them or make them stop. She was participating in them, learning their rhythms, understanding what she called the house's needs. By the second notebook, 1982, her entries had taken on a different quality. January 8th, 1982. I understand now why Mother stayed. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't hiding from grief. She was fulfilling an obligation that no one else knew existed. The house learned something from all those years of lighthouse keepers living here, of keepers lighting the lamps at 9:47 p.m. to begin the night watch, of maintaining constant vigilance over the water. It learned that this place matters, that watching matters, that keeping light in the darkness matters. When they automated the lighthouse in 1939 and eliminated Mother's position, they thought they were just updating technology, but they didn't understand what they were really doing. They were ending a human relationship with this place, a relationship that had existed for 54 years, ever since the lighthouse was built in 1885. Mother couldn't let that relationship end completely. So she bought the house. I found the deed in her papers, dated September 1940, and she stayed. She kept lighting lamps at 9:47 p.m. every night, maintaining the ritual even though it no longer had any official purpose. And somehow, I don't understand the mechanism, only the result. The house began to remember, to replicate the ritual on its own, to keep the watch even without a human keeper actively performing it. Mother's obligation became to witness what the house was doing, to make sure someone knew, to ensure that the watching, the caring, the vigilance didn't simply fade away as if it had never mattered. I spent Saturday reconstructing my grandmother's life from the evidence in the house, trying to build a picture of the woman who'd started whatever this was. Her bedroom was on the second floor, the one whose light came on last in the sequence I'd witnessed. The furniture was minimal, and I realized now that it was all Vera's additions. The room itself was just a shell, and in that shell, I found traces of what my grandmother had left behind. A photograph in the closet, fallen behind the baseboard. My grandmother as a young woman, maybe 30 years old, wearing a lighthouse keeper's practical uniform, standing on this same granite point with the lighthouse fully operational behind her. Her expression was serious, competent, the look of someone who understood her job and took it seriously. In the back of the closet shelf, I found her official logbook from her years as keeper, 1935 to 1939. The entries were professional, methodical, weather conditions, ships sighted, maintenance performed, incidents requiring intervention. The handwriting was clear and confident. The final entry was dated December 31st, 1939. Final day as official keeper. Automation complete. Position eliminated effective January 1st, 1940. The lighthouse no longer needs human tending. But I'm not convinced the watching is finished. Not convinced, as if she'd already suspected what would come next. I went back downstairs and made more coffee, my mind working through what I was learning, trying to construct a coherent explanation. By late afternoon, I thought I had one. An explanation that made sense, that felt both sad and complete. My grandmother had experienced some kind of psychological break when her position was eliminated. Her entire adult identity had been built around being a lighthouse keeper, and when that was taken away, she couldn't let it go. She'd bought the keeper's cottage and created an elaborate personal ritual, convincing herself that she still had a duty, still had a purpose, still mattered. The lights were probably some electrical system she'd installed herself, battery-powered, timer-controlled, elaborate enough to seem mysterious but ultimately mechanical. She'd documented it in her logbooks, maintaining the illusion of official duty, creating meaning out of loss. And when she died, Vera had inherited not just the house but the delusion. She'd found the notebooks, found the mechanism, and instead of recognizing it for what it was, a sad woman's attempt to maintain purpose, Vera had adopted the same belief system. She'd convinced herself that she was fulfilling a sacred obligation, that the house needed her presence, that the watching mattered. My mother's silence suddenly made sense. You can't argue with someone who's chosen an elaborate fiction over reality. You can't convince them they're wasting their life on a meaningless ritual. You can only let them go and hope they find some happiness in their delusion. I felt a wave of compassion for both women, my grandmother and Vera, who'd spent a combined 80 years in this house, performing a ritual that had meaning only to themselves. And I felt guilt for not having tried harder to maintain contact with Vera, for not understanding that her isolation wasn't a choice so much as a compulsion. At 9:30 p.m. on my second night in the house, I was in the living room, preparing to witness the lights with this new understanding. I'd located what I believed was the hidden control system, a metal box in the basement attached to what looked like old battery arrays, probably connected to the house's wiring through some mechanism I hadn't fully traced yet. I planned to wait until after the lights performed their sequence, then investigate more thoroughly and understand the mechanism. Tomorrow I'd call the realtor with a better understanding of what I'd inherited, a house with some quirky historical installation that would need to be disclosed to buyers, maybe even preserved as a curiosity. At 9:47 p.m., the lights came on exactly as they had the night before. I watched them with clinical attention this time, noting the sequence, estimating the intervals. Living room first, the 2 floor lamps and the table lamp coming on simultaneously. Then the hallway light, visible through the doorway. Then I heard the kitchen light click on. And finally, above me, the sound of the bedroom lamp, exactly as Vera's notes had described, exactly as my grandmother's later logbooks had recorded. But then something happened that my careful, rational explanation couldn't account for. The maritime chart above the fireplace began to glow. Not the frame, the chart itself. The paper was illuminating from within, as if there were a light source behind it, though it hung flat against the plaster wall with no space for anything to be concealed. I stood up from Vera's chair, my rational explanation already crumbling, and moved closer. The waters of the Bay of Fundy on the chart were turning luminous, the printed depth markers becoming brighter, more distinct. And as I watched, barely breathing, new information began to appear on the chart, not printed, but emerging as if the paper itself was remembering details it had once held. Additional depth soundings appeared in areas that had been blank, notations about currents and seasonal variations, warnings about submerged rocks and dangerous shoals, written in a cramped hand I didn't recognize, probably one of the lighthouse keepers from the decades before my grandmother. And then, in the margin near the bottom, in handwriting I'd seen in the photograph I'd found upstairs, my grandmother's unmistakable script appeared like developing film. The light marks what the water took. Keep it burning, or she'll forget which way is home. I reached out to touch the chart, to verify that I wasn't hallucinating, that the words were really there. The paper felt normal under my fingers. Just paper, cool and slightly textured. But the writing glowed as if backlit, my grandmother's words visible in a way they hadn't been when I'd glanced at the chart earlier in daylight. I pulled out my phone and took a photograph, terrified that when the lights went out the writing would disappear, and I'd convinced myself I'd imagined it. The photo captured the glowing chart but looked strange on my screen. The light too bright, the writing visible but somehow not quite right, as if the camera was trying to record something it wasn't designed to capture. The lights didn't go out at midnight this time. They stayed on. Living room, hallway, kitchen, bedroom, and now the glowing chart, steady and patient, as if the house was waiting for me to understand something. I stood staring at my grandmother's handwriting, my carefully constructed psychological explanation dissolving like mist. The light marks what the water took. Keep it burning or she'll forget which way is home. Who was she? I grabbed my laptop and started searching for the history of the Lubec lighthouse with new urgency, no longer looking for general information but for specific details, specific names, specific events. The lighthouse had been built in 1885. I'd already learned that. But now I dug deeper, finding historical records from the Library of Congress, digitized logbooks from the National Archives, newspaper articles from the Bangor Daily News going back a century. And I found something that made my hands freeze on the keyboard. On August 3, 1937, a young woman named Catherine Oakes had drowned in the Bay of Fundy approximately 2 miles from the Lubec lighthouse. She'd been sailing alone in a small boat when a sudden fog bank had rolled in, the kind of dense, disorienting fog the bay was notorious for, where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. She'd become disoriented, struck a submerged rock, and gone into the water. Her body was never recovered. The lighthouse keeper at the time, my grandmother, Margaret Wheeler, had testified at the inquest. She'd been on duty when the fog came in, had been sounding the foghorn and keeping the light burning, had done everything according to protocol. But the fog had been too thick, Catherine's boat too small and quiet to be heard over the foghorn's blast. By the time anyone realized she was missing, it was too late. The inquest ruled it an accidental death, no fault assigned. But I found something else in the newspaper archives, a brief article from 2 months later, in October 1937, describing how Margaret Wheeler had begun a practice of burning additional lamps in the keeper's cottage windows at night, in memory of the young woman lost to the fog. The lighthouse superintendent had noted the practice but hadn't forbidden it, recognizing it as a harmless memorial gesture. My grandmother had started lighting extra lamps at night in 1937, 2 years before her position was eliminated, 2 years before she bought the house and refused to leave. I went back to her official logbook and found the entry from August 3, 1937. Her handwriting was shakier than usual, Fog rolled in at 9:35 p.m. Visibility reduced to 0. Foghorn operating. Light burning. At 9:47 p.m. began additional watch protocols. Lit lamps and cottage windows to provide alternative visual references. Catherine Oakes reported missing at 11:15 p.m. Search began immediately. No trace found. Body not recovered. I was keeping watch. I was doing my duty. The light was burning, but she still couldn't find her way home. 9:47 p.m. The time my grandmother had begun lighting additional lamps on the night Catherine Oakes died. The same time the lights in this house had been coming on autonomously for the past 43 years. I called my mother. It was 11:30 p.m., late enough that she'd be annoyed, but I couldn't wait until morning. She answered on the 5th ring, her voice tight with the particular displeasure of being woken by a call she'd been expecting, but dreading. "Hannah, Mom, did Grandma ever talk about someone named Catherine Oakes?" Silence. The kind of silence that's too deliberate, too careful to be simple confusion. Did something happen in 1937? Did she feel responsible for someone drowning? "How do you know that name?" My mother's voice was sharp now, fully awake. "There are newspaper articles. Mom, public records. Why didn't anyone ever tell me?" Because it was over. Because Mother spent the rest of her life, literally the rest of her life, trying to make amends for something that wasn't her fault, and we weren't going to perpetuate that guilt into another generation. "What do you mean, make amends?" "The lights. Hannah, the lights at 9:47 every night. Mother was trying to, I don't know how to explain it without sounding insane. She was trying to keep a lighthouse burning for a woman who'd already drowned. She was convinced that if she maintained the ritual, if she kept the watch the way she should have that night, then somehow it would, I don't even know, balance the scales, provide guidance retroactively. It was magical thinking, grief and guilt twisted into obsession. But the lights still come on. Mom, I've seen them. The power's disconnected and the lights come on at 9:47 every night. Because Vera maintained whatever mechanism Mother set up. Because Vera inherited the same guilt, the same obsession, the same... "There's no mechanism," I interrupted. "I've looked. The breaker box is off. Everything's unplugged. But the lights come on anyway. And there's writing appearing on the maritime chart that wasn't there before. And I don't think this is about mechanism or delusion or guilt. I think something else is happening." My mother was quiet for a long moment. Then, so softly I almost didn't hear, "What kind of writing?" I read her the message from the chart. "The light marks what the water took. Keep it burning or she'll forget which way is home." Another long silence. When my mother spoke again, her voice was different, younger somehow, more vulnerable. That's exactly what Mother used to say, those exact words. She'd say them sometimes when she was lighting the lamps at night, like a prayer or an incantation. "Did you ever see the ships?" I asked, remembering Vera's entries about vessels moving through the fog. "What ships?" Vera's notebooks mentioned seeing ships during the lights. Ships moving through the bay, through fog, avoiding the rocks. "Hannah, there are no..." She stopped. "God, yes, I saw them. When I was a child, living in that house. I saw ships that shouldn't have been there, moving through water where no ships sailed. Old ships, with old lights. I saw them, and I knew somehow, that if I acknowledged seeing them, if I admitted they were real, I'd never be able to leave that house. So I taught myself not to see them. I convinced myself they were reflections, or distant lights from across the bay, or my imagination. And when I was old enough, I ran. Did they stop happening?" I asked. "I don't know. I never went back to find out. And when Mother died, when they found her, I went to the house exactly once, just long enough to meet with Vera and tell her to do whatever she wanted with the property. I didn't spend the night. I didn't stay past sunset. I couldn't bear the thought of being there at 9:47 p.m. "How did Grandma die?" I asked, realizing I'd never actually known the details. My mother's breath hitched. "She drowned. In the bathtub. They said it was an accident. She slipped. Hit her head. Couldn't get out. But Hannah, the water in the tub was salt water. Somehow, in a bathtub in a house half a mile from the ocean, she drowned in salt water. The police couldn't explain it. They listed it as an accident anyway because what else could they say? I looked at the glowing chart, at my grandmother's words. The light marks what the water took. She went looking for her," I said softly. She spent 37 years trying to light the way for Catherine Oakes to come home, and in the end, She went to find her instead. That's crazy. Is it? You saw the ships, Mom. You saw things that shouldn't exist. You ran away because you knew they were real, and you couldn't live with that reality. But what if Grandma and Vera weren't delusional? What if they understood something true? My mother didn't answer for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. If you're right, if any of this is real instead of just elaborate grief, then what does the house want from you? I looked around the illuminated living room, at the lamps burning without power, at the chart glowing with my grandmother's message, at the chair where Vera had sat for 43 years bearing witness. I think it wants me to understand, I said, to see what they saw, to know what they knew, and then to choose whether I'm going to keep the watch or let it finally end. And if you choose to keep it, then I become the third keeper, the third woman in our family to give up a normal life to serve a purpose no one else believes exists. Don't, my mother said, and now her voice was urgent, almost desperate. Please, Hannah, don't throw your life away for a house and a ritual and a woman who drowned 90 years ago. You have a career. You have friends. You have possibilities. Don't let that house convince you to sacrifice all of that. But even as she spoke, I was thinking about what I'd read in Vera's notebooks, about how she'd described the watching not as a burden, but as a purpose, about how my grandmother had chosen to buy the house and stay after her position was eliminated, not because she was broken, but because she'd found something worth protecting. At 1:33 a.m., I heard it, a foghorn, not the automated system from the defunct lighthouse that had been decommissioned completely years ago, but a deep, resonant blast, carrying across the water, the kind of sound that came from the era when fog signals were operated manually, when a keeper would pull the lever every 30 seconds during conditions of reduced visibility. I went to the window. The fog had come in while I'd been reading and calling my mother, rolling across the point like a living thing. I couldn't see 20 feet beyond the house, but in that wall of white, I saw lights, not modern navigation lights, not the cold LED brilliance of contemporary vessels, but warm, golden lights, the kind that came from oil lamps and lanterns, from an era when ships were made of wood and sailed by human hands on human knowledge. I counted 3 of them, moving through the fog with purpose, their positions changing as I watched. They were heading northeast, following a course that would take them past the submerged rocks and dangerous shoals that had claimed Catherine Oaks. And I understood, with a certainty that bypassed all logic and rationality, that those lights weren't in the present, they were in the past, and the house was showing them to me. The house was keeping them visible. The house was making sure someone remembered that they'd existed, that they'd needed guidance, that the lighthouse keeper's work had mattered, and maybe, possibly, the house was still providing that guidance, across decades and through fog both meteorological and temporal, keeping watch over ships that had sailed generations ago but still needed to be remembered as having sailed safely. I pressed my hand against the cold window glass and watched the lights move through the impossible fog until they disappeared into the white. Behind me, the lamps in the living room burned steady. The house was patient. It had waited 43 years for me. It could wait a little longer for me to understand. I found the full story in a box in the basement, tucked behind the obsolete heating system Vera had replaced with a more efficient model, sometime in the 1990s. The box was labeled in my grandmother's handwriting, C.O. Personal Effects, 1937. Inside were things that should have been returned to Catherine Oaks' family after her death, but somehow had ended up here instead. A leather journal with entries describing her plans to sail solo around the New England coast. Watercolor paintings of the bay at different times of day, showing an artist's eye for light and atmosphere. A letter addressed to mother and father that had never been sent, describing how much Catherine loved Lubec, how peaceful she found the isolation, how she'd decided to extend her visit through the fall. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept it dry and preserved for nearly 90 years, I found my grandmother's private journal from 1937. The entries before August 3rd were routine keeper's notes mixed with personal observations. My grandmother had been 27 years old, one of the few female lighthouse keepers in the country, fiercely proud of her position and competent at her work. She'd written about the satisfaction of maintaining the light, of knowing that ships depended on her vigilance, of being part of a tradition that stretched back centuries. And she'd written about Catherine Oaks, who'd rented a cottage in town for the summer, and had become something my grandmother hesitantly, carefully described as A friend. July 15th, 1937. Catherine came by this afternoon with her sketchbook. She's been painting the lighthouse from different angles, trying to capture what she calls the geometry of human defiance against natural chaos. We sat on the rocks for hours while she worked. She asked me why I chose this life, the isolation, the demanding schedule, the constant responsibility. I told her I chose it because someone has to care, someone has to keep watch. She understood immediately. She said that's why she paints, to mark what matters before it's lost. July 28th, 1937. Catherine has asked me to teach her navigation. She wants to understand the charts, the depth soundings, the way keepers mark dangers and safe passages. I've been showing her how to read the water, how to judge currents by color and surface texture, how to navigate by landmarks and compass when fog obscures visibility. She's a quick study, smart and careful. She says she trusts the lighthouse more than any compass. August 1st, 1937. 2 more days and Catherine returns to Boston. I don't want to think about the house being empty again. The days without her visits, the evenings without her voice. She asked me tonight if I ever thought about leaving, about doing something else with my life. I told her no. This is my life. This matters. She nodded and said, I know. That's what I love about you. You've found your calling, and you're faithful to it. Then she said something I've been thinking about all night. Promise me if anything ever happens, you'll keep the light burning. Promise me you'll always keep watch. I had to stop reading. My hands were shaking and my eyes were blurred with tears I didn't fully understand. Catherine hadn't been just a friend. She'd been someone my grandmother loved. I kept reading, forcing myself through the entry from August 3rd. August 3rd, 1937. She's gone. Catherine is gone. The fog came in so fast, faster than I've ever seen. One moment the bay was clear, and the next it was a white wall, visibility 0. I sounded the horn immediately. I maintained the light. I did everything right. Everything I was trained to do. But Catherine had taken the boat out an hour earlier, before the fog. She knew how to sail. I'd watched her dozens of times. She was careful and skilled, but the fog confused her. I know it did because I heard her boat's bell. I heard it ringing in the wrong direction, heading toward the shoals instead of toward the harbor. I screamed into the fog. I rang every bell I could find. I lit every lamp in the cottage and placed them in the windows facing the water, desperate to give her something to navigate toward besides the lighthouse beam. At 9:47 p.m., I lit the last lamp, the one in the keeper's bedroom upstairs, and I stood at that window and I prayed to a God I've never believed in, that Catherine would see the lights, would understand the pattern, would know which way was home. But she didn't come home. She struck the rocks at the point where the currents are worst, where the tide drops 28 feet in 6 hours and creates whirlpools strong enough to pull down anything that ventures too close. They found pieces of her boat 3 days later. They never found her. I failed her. I failed at the one thing I was supposed to do. I failed to keep her safe. I failed to bring her home. But I swear on everything I am, I will never fail to keep watch again. I will light those lamps every night at 9:47 p.m. for the rest of my life. I will maintain the pattern I created trying to guide her. And if there's any chance, any possibility that light persists in ways we don't understand, that human intention can echo across time, that the caring continues even when the caring comes too late, then maybe, somehow, Catherine will find her way home. The final entry in my grandmother's journal was from December 31st, 1939. They're eliminating my position tomorrow. Automation, they call it. Progress. The lighthouse will burn automatically now. No human keeper required. They think they're just updating technology, but they're wrong. They're ending a relationship between this place and the people who've served it, between the light and the keepers who've maintained it, between the watching and what's being watched for. I'm buying the cottage. I've saved enough from my salary. I will continue to live here, and I will continue to light the lamps at 9:47 p.m. every night. The official lighthouse may no longer need me, but Catherine still does. The keeping may no longer be my job, but it's still my calling. I made a promise. I will keep it until I die. I sat in the basement with the journal in my lap, understanding finally why my grandmother had stayed, why Vera had stayed, why the house had learned to continue the ritual even after both women were gone. This wasn't about guilt or obsession or psychological break. This was about love, about a promise made to someone who died before that promise could be fulfilled, about the desperate human need to believe that caring matters even, especially, when it's too late to make a difference. If you're still listening, you're already part of this house. I carried the journal upstairs and sat in Vera's chair, my grandmother's chair before that, and I spoke aloud to the empty, illuminated room. I understand now. You weren't crazy. You weren't wasting your lives. You were keeping a promise. You were maintaining watch for someone who needed guidance, who needed to know the light was still burning, who needed to find her way home. The lamps seemed to burn warmer, though that might have been my imagination. The house settled around me with small sounds, floorboards creaking, windows shifting in their frames, the particular sigh of an old building relaxing into itself. I opened Vera's most recent notebook and found an entry I'd missed before, from just a week before she died. March 10th. I'm dying. The doctor doesn't say so directly, but I can feel it. Heart disease, probably. I'm 78 years old and I've spent 57 of those years in this house. People would say I wasted my life. Mother wasted hers. 2 women who threw everything away for a ritual that serves no practical purpose, that helps no one, that changes nothing. But they're wrong. Every night when the lights come on, I see the ships moving safely through the fog. I don't know if they're real ships from the past or echoes or something else entirely, but I know they matter. I know the watching matters, and I know that when I'm gone, the house will keep doing what it's learned to do. It will keep the light burning at 9:47 p.m. It will maintain the pattern. It will preserve the promise. I hope whoever comes next understands. I hope they choose to stay, to witness, to make sure the house isn't alone in its remembering. But if they don't, if they sell the property and leave, I believe the house will continue anyway, because that's what love does. It persists. It continues. It refuses to let go even when letting go would be easier, more logical, more sane. Mother taught the house to remember. I taught it that the remembering is witnessed and valued. Maybe the next keeper will teach it something new, or maybe they'll just learn what we learned, that sometimes the most important work is simply to maintain a light in the darkness and trust that it matters, even when you can't see who it's guiding home. I closed the notebook and looked at the clock on the mantel. 9:30 p.m. 17 minutes until the next cycle began. I thought about my life in Boston. My apartment with its city views and its monthly rent that ate half my paycheck. My job analyzing marketing data for a company that sold athletic wear. My friends who I saw once a month for brunch and considered myself close to. My dating life that consisted of apps and awkward dinners and occasional relationships that fizzled after a few months. I thought about what I'd be giving up if I stayed, and what I'd be gaining. Purpose, meaning, connection to something larger than my own small life, the knowledge that I was maintaining something precious, even if no one else understood or valued it. At 9:47 p.m., the lights came on for my 4th night in the house. This time, I wasn't afraid. This time, I stood and walked through each room as the lights illuminated, touching the lamps gently, acknowledging what they represented. Living room, hallway, kitchen. Then upstairs to the bedroom where my grandmother had lit the last lamp on the night Catherine Oakes died, where Vera had slept for 43 years, where I would sleep tonight if I chose to stay. I stood at the bedroom window looking out at the fog-wrapped point, and I saw them clearly now. Not 3 ships, but 7, moving through the white, their lights warm and certain, their courses true. Ships that had sailed this coast 100 years ago and needed to be remembered as having sailed safely because someone had kept watch, someone had cared enough to maintain the light. I pulled out my phone and made a call. "Mom," I said when she answered. "I'm staying." My mother came to Lubec 3 weeks later. She'd resisted at first, pleaded with me to reconsider, to just take a longer leave of absence instead of quitting my job entirely, to at least try commuting before committing fully to relocating. But I'd already made my decision, and eventually she'd accepted that arguing was pointless. She arrived on a Friday afternoon in mid-April, driving up from Portland where she'd spent the night rather than make the trip from Boston in one day. I watched her car pull into the driveway and saw her sit there for several minutes before getting out, staring at the house the way someone might look at a place where something terrible had happened to them. "It looks exactly the same," she said when she finally emerged. 60 years since I left and it looks exactly the same. I wanted to hug her, but something in her posture warned me off. She stood by her car looking at the house, at the granite point, at the lighthouse ruins visible in the distance, and I saw her shoulders shaking slightly with suppressed emotion. "You don't have to come inside," I said gently. "We could go to town, get dinner, talk there." "No," she straightened. "I came to see you, to understand what you've chosen. I need to see it. We went inside together. She stopped immediately inside the door, her breath catching. Nothing had changed from when she'd lived here as a child, except for minor updates Vera had made over the decades. A newer refrigerator, updated bathroom fixtures, better insulation, but the bones of the house were identical. "Mother's chair is still here," she said, pointing to the chair by the window where I'd been sitting every night at 9:47. Vera kept everything exactly as it was. She understood the importance of continuity, I said, of maintaining the pattern. My mother walked through the room slowly, touching things lightly, the mantel, the stair railing, the kitchen counter. "I was happy here as a child," she said quietly. "I didn't realize that until just now. I spent so many years thinking about this house as the place that stole my mother from me, the place that trapped Vera, that I forgot there were good years too, before I understood what was happening, before I realized what the lights meant." We spent the afternoon talking. I showed her the notebooks, my grandmother's, Vera's, and the one I'd started keeping myself. She read through them with tears streaming down her face, not bothering to wipe them away. "They were in love," she said, after reading my grandmother's journal. "Mother and Catherine. I never knew. Mother never told me. It was 1937, I said. She couldn't tell anyone. So she spent 42 years keeping a vigil for a woman she loved, but could never publicly claim, lighting lamps every night, as if Catherine might still need them. And then Vera continued it for another 43 years, keeping watch for a promise she didn't make but understood anyway. My mother closed the journal carefully. "And now you're going to do the same. I don't know how long I'll stay," I said honestly. "But yes, for now, for as long as it feels right. And if it never stops feeling right, if you're still here at 43 years old, then 53, then 73, and you've spent your whole life maintaining a ritual for a woman who died before you were born, would that be so terrible?" I asked. "Yes." My mother's voice was fierce. "Yes, Hannah, it would be terrible, because you deserve your own life, your own loves, your own purposes that you choose rather than inherit. Don't you want those things?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I thought I did, but I've been happier these past 3 weeks than I've been in years in Boston. I wake up knowing what I'm going to do with my day. I feel connected to something that matters. Because the house has convinced you that you matter to it," my mother said. "But that's not the same as actually mattering. That's not the same as being loved by living people who choose you specifically, rather than inheriting you as the next available keeper." I didn't have an answer for that. At 9:30 p.m., my mother stood to leave. I should go back to town, get a hotel room. "You could stay," I offered. "See the lights. Understand what I'm witnessing." She shook her head firmly. "I saw them when I was 8 years old and they terrified me. Not because they were frightening, but because they were beautiful. And I knew that if I let myself believe in their beauty, I'd never escape. I chose to escape, Hannah. I chose a different life, and I don't regret that choice. I'm not asking you to. Aren't you, by staying here, by continuing this, aren't you implicitly saying that Mother and Vera were right and I was wrong?" "No," I said. "And I'm saying they made one choice and you made another, and both choices were valid for the people who made them. I'm not judging your decision, Mom. Please don't judge mine." She hugged me then, hard and long. "I love you," she said, "and I'm terrified for you, but I'll respect your choice, even though I don't understand it." After she left, I sat in the keeper's chair and waited. At 9:47 p.m., the lights came on. Living room, hallway, kitchen, bedroom, the familiar sequence I'd witnessed now for 21 consecutive nights. And through the window, in the spring fog that had rolled in at sunset, I saw ships moving through the dark water. I pulled out my notebook and made my entry. April 17th, lights, 9:47 p.m., full sequence. Mother visited today. She's still angry at this house, still convinced it steals lives rather than gives them purpose. Maybe she's right. Maybe in 40 years I'll look back and see tonight as the moment I should have walked away. But I don't think so. I think I'll look back and see tonight as the moment I finally understood what I was willing to give in exchange for what I'm receiving. The knowledge that my grandmother's promise is still being kept, that Catherine Oakes is still being watched for, that love persists even across death and decades and the impossible distance between what was and what is. I paused, pen hovering over paper, then added, "I found a photograph today in the box with Catherine's things, a picture of her and my grandmother together on the rocks, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. They look so happy, so alive, And I understood that the keeping isn't about death at all. It's about preserving life, the fact that these two women existed, that they loved each other, that their love mattered enough that someone should remember it. That's worth keeping watch for. That's worth maintaining the light. At 12:15 a.m., the lights went out. I sat in the dark for a while, listening to the house settle around me, feeling its presence the way you feel another person in a quiet room. "I won't abandon you," I said to the darkness. "I won't let you forget what you're remembering. I promise." And in the silence, I could have sworn I heard the house respond, not in words, but in the particular quality of quiet that comes when someone hears you and understands. Summer came to Lubec with a gentleness that surprised me. I'd expected harsh weather, dramatic storms, the kind of punishing conditions that tested keepers and justified the existence of lighthouses. Instead, I got long evenings of golden light, fog that rolled in soft and dreamy rather than threatening. Tourists who discovered the easternmost point of the United States and took photos without ever knowing what happened here at 9:47 every night. I'd been in the house for 3 months when I finally understood what Vera had meant by "the house is learning." It started small. The lights began staying on a few minutes longer each night. Not much, just 5 or 10 minutes added to the usual 2.5 hours. Then I noticed that on nights when I was particularly tired or sad, the bedroom lamp would come on slightly brighter, as if offering extra comfort. And on the anniversary of Catherine Oak's death, August 3rd, the lights came on at 9:47 and stayed on until dawn, as if the house was keeping an all-night vigil. But the real change came in September. I'd started painting. Not seriously, not with any particular skill, but Catherine's watercolors in the basement box had inspired me to try. I'd bought supplies in town and set up a small easel by the living room window, trying to capture the way the light hit the water at different times of day. On September 15th, I was working on a painting at 9:30 p.m., too absorbed to notice the time until I heard the familiar click of the first lamp switching on. I started to set down my brush and move to the keeper's chair, as had become my ritual, but something stopped me. The living room lamps came on as usual. But then, instead of proceeding to the hallway, a light I'd never seen before illuminated, a small fixture above the fireplace, one I hadn't even known existed, casting a warm glow directly onto my painting. The house had added a new light to its sequence, not to the rooms it had memorized from years of observation, but to the activity I was doing, the thing that mattered to me in the moment. The house was responding not just to pattern, but to purpose. I sat frozen with my paintbrush in hand, staring at the illuminated canvas, and whispered, "You're not just remembering, you're participating." The light above my painting brightened slightly, as if in acknowledgement. Over the following weeks, I tested this new development carefully. When I sat reading in the keeper's chair, the reading lamp would come on brighter than the others. When I worked at the desk Vera had used, a light I'd never noticed in the ceiling fixture would focus its beam on the desktop. The house wasn't just maintaining my grandmother's pattern anymore. It was building on it, adapting it, making it relevant to my presence. I documented everything in my notebook, the way Vera had, the way my grandmother had. But now my entries included a new category: house responses to current keeper. October 3rd, lights, 9:47 p.m. Standard sequence plus workspace illumination. I told the house about my day-to-day, about the research I've been doing into the history of female lighthouse keepers, about the article I'm writing for a maritime history journal. When the lights came on, the desk lamp was brighter than usual. The house wants me to keep working. The house approves. My mother called every Sunday. Our conversations had become easier, more honest. She'd stopped trying to convince me to leave and started asking about what I was actually doing with my time. I told her about the painting, the writing, the way I'd turned Vera's solitary vigil into something more active and engaged. "You sound happy," she admitted one Sunday in October. "I hate that you sound happy." "Why do you hate it?" "Because if you sound happy, I can't keep telling myself you're making a mistake. I can't keep hoping you'll come to your senses and return to normal life. This is my normal life now, Mom." I know. That's what terrifies me. But her terror had lost its edge. She was accepting, slowly, that I'd chosen this, that I was making it work. In November, something happened that changed everything. I met someone. Her name was Alex. She was a marine biologist studying tidal patterns in the Bay of Fundy, and she'd rented a cottage in Lubec for 6 months of field research. We met at the library, both reaching for the same book about local maritime history. We got coffee. We talked for 3 hours. She asked if I wanted to have dinner sometime. I said yes. On our third date, I told her about the house, about the lights, about my grandmother and Catherine Oakes and Vera, and the promise that had been kept for nearly 90 years. I expected skepticism, maybe gentle mockery, definitely the kind of slow backing away that happens when someone reveals they believe in something impossible. Instead, Alex said, "Can I see it? The lights, I mean, can I be there at 9:47 sometime?" She came the following Friday. We had dinner. I'd learned to cook properly over the summer, filling the kitchen with smells and life in a way I don't think Vera ever had. At 9:30, we were washing dishes together when I said, "It's almost time." We sat in the living room, on the sofa my grandmother had probably chosen, and waited. At 9:47, the lights came on. Living room, hallway, kitchen, bedroom, plus the small light above where my easel stood, plus a light I'd never seen before. A fixture by the sofa where Alex and I were sitting, casting a warm glow that included both of us in its circle. Alex didn't speak for several minutes. She just watched, breathing carefully, as the house filled with impossible light. Finally, she said, "I believe you." Just like that, I'm a scientist. I observe phenomena, and I document what I observe. I just observed light emanating from sources without electrical connection or apparent power supply. So, yes, I believe you. And you're not running. You're not thinking I'm crazy. Are you crazy? I thought about it honestly. I don't think so. I think I'm doing something unusual, maybe something most people wouldn't understand. But I think I'm doing it for good reasons, and I think I'm happy. So no, I don't think I'm crazy. Then neither do I. Alex took my hand. "Tell me more about Catherine." We sat in the glowing living room, and I told her everything. About my grandmother's journal, about the love that couldn't be acknowledged publicly, about the promise to keep the light burning, about how the house had learned to maintain that promise long after the original keepers were gone. "So you're keeping watch for a love story," Alex said. "I'm keeping watch for a woman who loves someone enough to spend the rest of her life making sure that person wouldn't be forgotten." "That's beautiful." Alex was quiet for a moment. "And terrifying. Because what if you meet someone? What if you fall in love? Can you leave? Can you have a life outside this house and this ritual?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Vera never did. My grandmother never did after Catherine died. They chose the keeping over everything else. But maybe you don't have to," Alex said. "Maybe the house has learned enough now that it doesn't need a keeper who gives up everything. Maybe it's ready for a keeper who has a life of her own, but chooses to include the keeping in that life. I've thought about that, but I don't know if it's possible." "Try," Alex said simply. "Try to have both. And if it doesn't work, if the house demands everything or nothing, then you'll know. But don't assume you have to make the same choice they made just because they made it." Over the next 3 months, I tried. I spent time with Alex, dinners in town, day trips to other parts of the coast, weekends when she came to the house and stayed through multiple cycles of the lights, becoming familiar with the pattern, comfortable with the strangeness. I continued my painting and my writing. I video called with friends from Boston who were baffled by my new life, but willing to maintain the connection. And every night at 9:47, I was in the house to witness the lights. The house adapted. On nights when Alex stayed over, an additional light would come on in the bedroom. Not bright, just a gentle glow that said, "I see you both. I welcome you both." On days when I was working intensely and lost track of time, the lights would come on but stay dimmer, less demanding of my attention, as if the house understood I had other things I needed to focus on. The house was learning that love could include the keeping without being consumed by it. On March 20th, exactly 1 year since I'd first arrived, I made a decision. I asked Alex to move in with me. "Are you sure?" she asked. "This is your grandmother's house, Vera's house. Are you sure you want to share it?" "I'm sure I want to stop choosing between the life I've built here and the life I could have with you. I'm sure I want to try having both." She moved in on a Saturday in April. We combined our furniture, our books, our lives. The house made room for her things without complaint, as if it had been waiting for this expansion all along. And on the first night we were both living there, at 9:47 p.m., something happened that made me cry. The lights came on in the standard sequence. But then, for the first time in the 90 years since my grandmother had started this ritual, a new room was added to the pattern, a small storage room off the kitchen that we'd converted into Alex's office for her research. The house was keeping watch over Alex, too. The keeping had expanded to include not just Catherine Oakes, Not just the memory of my grandmother's love, but the love I was building in the present. That night, after the lights went out at midnight, I made my final entry in the notebook. April 25th, 1 year and 5 days since I arrived. The house has learned something my grandmother and Vera never taught it, something I barely understand myself, that the keeping doesn't have to mean sacrificing everything else, that maintaining the light can be part of a full life rather than a replacement for one. The house remembers Catherine. It remembers my grandmother's promise. It remembers Vera's faithfulness. But now it's also remembering me and Alex, and the possibility that love doesn't have to be locked in the past to be preserved. I'm the lighthouse keeper's daughter, and the keeper's niece, and now the keeper myself. But I'm also a partner, a friend, a person with a life that extends beyond these walls. And somehow, impossibly, the house has learned to hold all of that at once. I don't know if I'll be here for 43 years like Vera. I don't know if Alex and I will last, or if other changes will come that I can't anticipate. But I know this: the watching will continue, the light will keep burning, and for the first time in 90 years, the keeper won't have to choose between the keeping and the living. The house has finally learned what my grandmother was really trying to teach it all along: that love, all love, in every form, is worth keeping watch for. I closed the notebook and looked at Alex sleeping in the keeper's bed, her breathing steady and peaceful. Outside, the fog was rolling in from the bay. Somewhere in that fog, ships that had sailed decades ago were moving safely past the rocks, guided by a light that shouldn't exist, but refused to stop burning. And in this house, in this moment, I understood something that made all of it make sense. I wasn't the lighthouse keeper's daughter. I was the lighthouse keeper's continuation. And the light my grandmother had lit for Catherine Oakes was still burning, not because the past couldn't be released, but because some loves are worth maintaining across every distance, every impossibility, every year that tries to erase them. The house had always been conscious. It had always been remembering. But now, finally, it was also forgiving, releasing the keepers from the obligation to sacrifice everything, allowing the watching to be a choice freely made rather than a burden grimly borne. The house had learned to love back, and that made all the difference. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing stories about houses that hide what no one wanted to face, and what happens when someone finally chooses to see.